And Apolline, are you there? We can't see you, but I think I can hear you. Oh, now we can see you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
thanks
so
so much.
sorry, I was going to say the floor
properly?
is yours, 20 minutes, and
Thank you so much. Apologies again for the technicalities. I'm so sorry that that Kerry had to step in. Thanks, Kerry, and also because I guess that my presentation would have been a great prequel to her work. I'm also sorry for not being here in person. I heard that most of the talks you've been hearing so far are fabulous, and I hope that what I'm going to say is not going to sound too boring after all the already digested. So I'd like to start with, can we go to the first slide, please? Okay, so one key point that has been made about algorithmic fairness or technofixes to AI ethics is the limits of a liberal approach to questions of social justice, especially if they are understood in strictly redistributive terms. So Arthur Cassius that I wrote in a recent paper, I quote, "The algorithmic fairness literature primarily seeks to mathematically formulate criteria of social justice with the avowed objective of remedying or preventing wrongful harms resulting from biased algorithmic outputs." And by this, she means to focus our attention on the fact that a lot of the philosophical investigations that have occurred around algorithmic fairness so far have mostly sought to clarify our intuitions about justice or to solve resource allocation problems to bring about unbiased data sets, etc. I want to say just before moving on that, of course, I'm aware that there is a much broader critical literature on decolonial feminist intersectional approaches to AI in a more epistemological or design-oriented way that I think Tomasz really well illustrated. Here in my talk, I really want to focus on these more traditionally philosophical explorations that have occurred in this realm of AI ethics that we are concerned with. And you might know also that apparently one of AI's so-called godfathers just a few days ago suggested that philosophy has nothing to bring to the discussion of AI ethics. Obviously, I'm assuming the opposite, that philosophical investigations are somehow useful. And I had no idea that by taking that stance, I would be giving such a controversial talk. Okay, so returning to Cassius-Zadeh, as I imagine is quite familiar to most of you. So Cassius-Zadeh points out that the problem with approaches to justice in distributive terms is that, of course, they don't take structural injustice into account. So this sounds, I think, in part obvious, but I think it's quite important and clarifying to pause on what we mean by structural injustice. And this, I want to follow Cassius-Zadeh a little bit in her exploration of the work of a very important feminist political theorist called Iris Young, whose work really helped a lot, whole political theory generation to think about what it means to focus on domination and oppression instead of distribution when we talk about justice. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so Young defined in a very important book called Justice and the Politics of Difference from 1990, she defined oppression and difference as what she called disabling constraints. That is, I quote, structural or systemic phenomena which exclude people from participating in determining their actions or the conditions of their actions. This means that oppression can occur in a rather well-functioning liberal democracy without any malicious intent. So, for instance, the harms of large language models do not need any malicious intent on the part of a small group of designers seeking to harm disadvantaged communities, but still there is harm that is produced. It also means, according, if we follow Young's idea of oppression and domination, that it does not require an identified group of oppressor, let's say a data scientist, but it privileges a group over another, let's say white, able Western women over other groups. It's quite important. For instance, it doesn't make any difference to a person in a wheelchair that she's entitled to a fair trial if she needs to take the stairs to access the court. And I think a good analogy with the current AI ethics discussion might be to say that it's not enough to say that the data sets are unbiased, but if we don't have access to the actual data sets in which large language models are trained. Another way that Young's work departed from liberal conceptions of justice was in her insistence that group and individual identity are neither essential nor purely voluntary, but that they mutually shape each other in a way that enables or that constrains one's actions. This means that if you are part of an oppressed or privileged group, this is likely to change how you perceive public spaces, how you walk in the streets by night, how you feel about walking in the streets by night. In other words, being part of an oppressed group also changes who you are. And indeed, the same goes with online spaces, which are notoriously spaces of gender-based violence, as recent reports show once again. So here, Jung's discussion is really insightful, as Cassia said, also shows, but it also, of course, draws on a much broader discussion in feminism, which is who is the subject that we are talking about when we talk about the people that we want to emancipate or from patriarchal order. What kind of humans and women do we talk about? And once again, these are questions that have been part of feminist thought for a very long time, and more specifically, since the 1980s. There have been more systematic attempts at overcoming what feminist scholar Elizabeth Spellman called the solipsism of women. By which she meant that mostly the woman that was assumed in a lot of feminist claims at the time often had the attributes and the experiences of white bourgeois women identified women, not the attributes or the experience of the Black domestic workers who took part in the daily lives of white families. That the African-American sociologist Patricia Hale Collins describes, not the ones of what the philosopher and LGBTQ activist Robin Dembroff calls the genderqueer category, as those who resist gender classification altogether, both in terms of identification and in terms of oppression. So feminism has had a long tradition of anti-essentialism, of pointing out that this category of women, these gender categories are not given and that we need all the dimensions of justice to grasp all the many ways in which oppression unfolds. So this is why indeed this is a very important tradition of thought that has badly been taken over by AI ethics. Another way in which feminism provides very crucial resources for thinking subjectivation and embodiment beyond the human is by challenging exceedingly established narratives about what constitutes a livable or an authentic life. So here I would refer to the works by Judith Butler on vulnerability, or our colleague at Cambridge, Lauren Wilcox on drones and posthuman constellation, in which the feminist series have allowed to challenge dominant discourses about what kinds of gender identities are real or artificial or delusional, whose bodies matter or to be marred or exposed, or which are the targets of targeted killing or border control, etc. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Indeed, this is also something that Kerry has mentioned in her talk. Feminists like Donna Haraway have engaged very literally with posthuman figures and the transformative or emancipatory power of technology, not understood as something external to humans, but really as something that was socially shaped and that took part in the shaping of gender identities and relations as well. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because, of course, Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto from 1985 is quite well known, and also her more recent work in which She has suggested other non-human metaphors beyond the cyborg to help us rethink relationships with non-human life forms that do not involve appropriation or control, but care and cohabitation. Once again, this links with the discussion that Kerry has introduced in her talk before. And this has indeed already been taken over in discussions of data science, for instance, in D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's great work in which they show that Haraway's idea that knowledge is always situated, embodied, and affective can be an inspiration for data visualization practices that avoid representing things as if they were neutral, and so in fact implicitly re-articulating masculine visions of the world. And that indeed there are many other ways in which we can collect and visualize data in a way that embraces the embodied and the affective character of data production. And I think a great example of this, I mean, Tom has showed us many illustrations of this, but another maybe is this, another great example of this more ecological thinking is a digital art project. Can we move to the next slide, please? So I understand that some of the art projects, maybe this is something that you've been seeing at the conference, because this is an art project that was developed by an artist called Iraklis Eberkia, who was in residence in Bonn last year. Through which he curated stories of displaced populations at the Georgian border in Russian occupied territories. And he set up this open source application that allowed users to recover stories and memories of their lost towns. So of ways in a way re-engaging with lost complex environments. So feminist thinking about the multiplicity of identities and the fact that we find ourselves in a like sort of ecology of relationships is indeed something that is especially relevant in the current discourse, especially as there's can we move to the next slide, please? Yes, especially in the context of recurring narratives about AI and human speech or human intelligence or human text that is resurging recently around ChatGPT. Okay, I want to say a bit more about how feminism decentering of human perspectives also ties in with environmental concerns in a less straightforward, but also, I think, a no less important way. Next slide again, please. So I guess everyone has seen Jeff Hinton's pictures over the past weeks and follows this revival of discourse around superintelligence. I imagine this has also been a topic over the past days. Here, I want to refer to the very important work that two AI ethicists have been doing, Eugenia Stamboliev and Mark Kokelberg, who have shown that the discourse of urgency that there is around AI, and especially extreme long-term AI risks, reinforces a kind of techno-solutionist climate crisis discourse that in fact also contributes to the hegemony of a particular take on climate politics. And I think what their work helps us understand is how underlying these narratives about AI risk and superintelligence, there is also a form of Promethean discourse that posits a competitive model of intelligence in which there's this sort of unavoidable conflict between human and artificial intelligence, but also that assumes a deterministic view of technological acceleration and also a developmental account of human progress, assuming that humanity needs either to adapt or to perish. So there is a longer history of Prometheanism. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you so much. Actually, right now, I'm at University College in Oxford, which is the college where William Seeley was so the writer of one of the first Promethean texts called Prometheus Unbound. There is also, one could mention Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in the much longer history of Promethean narratives. But more specifically, what we can note is that there has been, since the 70s and 80s, really the turn of this Promethean tradition to a more specifically market-centered Prometheanism, an idea of Prometheanism in which the overcoming of human limits would occur through a reorganization of social orders through the market. And I think it's a very important history that also needs to be told and investigated. Partly because here we have figures of the more than human that exactly go opposite to what is intended with post-human feminist approaches inspired by Haraway's work, for instance. Maybe returning to what feminist theories of justice, such as Young's, can help us conceptualize. I think what Young's work and others help us think through is a kind of responsibility towards the future that does not involve deciding on the justice of current decisions based on cost-benefit analysis of future welfare over billions of years, or seeking to maintain the civilizational dominance or progress, but instead that suggests that we can reflect on how current climate politics can involve historical reparations for past and present injustices, including ecological losses, destructions of ecosystems and lands, etc. And I would argue that this is something for which we need not only better images of AI, value-sensitive design across social and cultural contexts, better stories, more varied stories, etc., but also indeed a deep critique of the ideological discourse that hegemonic future AI narratives are part of. This includes, I think, not only tracing instances of ethics washing and reappropriation of critical discourse. And I think it's worth noting that, of course, feminist concerns now are everywhere. And in a sense, we found ourselves in a quite different and it may be in a way more challenging position than feminists were in the 90s, where anti-feminist discourse was very vocal and explicit, but also in this way also very easy to pin down. So I gave you on the slide on the right, you can read an example of this unapologetic anti-feminist stance that comes from libertarian transhumanist mailing list from the late 90s. Where the contributor that explains that Haraway's cyborg doesn't really fit with that project. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's what I want to say is that this like critical historical work is also crucial to understand what makes these discourses about superintelligence and the sort of market-oriented Prometheanism that underlies them. What makes these discourses hold, even if I assume a substantial part of the participants in this conference agree that indeed feminism is relevant to AI ethics. Maybe if we move to the next slide. Thank you so much. I wanted to end my talk with this image of Marvin Minsky, so one of the, let's say, great grandfathers of AI, if we want to continue on the theme of paternalist metaphors. So Minsky was one of the founders of the first and the most well-funded AI labs in the 50s at the MIT, and in the 80s, while his symbolic AI agenda was sort of losing public interest and funding, he started really spending time with a weird crowd of tech gurus and media entrepreneurs like Stewart Brand and neoliberal economists who were interested in the ways that AI could help predict the future of markets. And here you see him in this picture that comes from the Puppet papers at MIT. You can see him taking part in a conference that was organized in the late 80s in California, during which participants were taking part in all sorts of original activities like paintball, but also bird watching. And it was a conference about how to use complex systems approaches and cybernetic approaches to predict the future of markets in the context of the post oil crisis, and how to think about like overcoming these doomsday predictions about environmental limits. And what's interesting is that a lot of this conference was about how to use these cybernetic AI approaches to overcome the boundary between human and non-human and nature and culture. And I think that we also need to recover how, like, within dominant AI discourse, there is also a contestation of binarisms that we think about as problematic and Cartesian, and that there is also like an anti-rationalist and anti-Cartesian strand of thought within dominant AI discourse that we need to face if we want to criticize dominant AI ideologies and their underlying ideology of growth that has immediate implications for how we think about sustainable AI. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you so much for your attention, and yeah, I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Apolline. That was exactly 20 minutes as well, so thank you. Okay, we have about 15 minutes. So of course, if I understand the idea correctly, of course, if there are direct questions for Apolline, now is the time to ask. But also, if there are any more general questions for the team about the project, the goals, the interconnections or otherwise, now is also the time to ask. So any questions on either of these lines here, and of course for the online audience to add their questions into the Q&A, which I will check. I see a question from Aimee.
Thank you. Thanks to all three speakers. So my question is for all three, Apolline, but thank you for your talk. Just like Taylor said, actually, a question about the interconnectedness of the research that you're doing, because all three talks were, coming from different lenses, also addressing different issues, yeah. And so I wonder if you could explain to the audience about how the research is coming together, and maybe how you work together as well.
Thanks, Aimee. This is a very important question. So I think in a way we should have arranged the panel differently. Probably Kerry and Apolline should have started and I should have been the last one, but we decided to ease you into these topics with my slightly more down-to-earth presentation. But in essence, I think what we're trying to do is think how the kind of theories that Apolline and Kerry are working on could be translated into practice. And this is why I'm theorizing what this translation might look like, so that we can move on to the next stage and actually try to see how it it could translate into design policy questions. I don't know, Kerry, do you have any?
Are you going to work with designers? Sorry, Kerry, just to follow up. So, Tom, when you say, will this have an impact on designers, is your plan to work with designers? I'm also asking this for other people.
Well, so we haven't gotten to the stage of working as a team on the translation, but yes, I am working with two design teams on testing some of the ideation tools that I'm coming up with, such as the one I briefly mentioned, the environment as a user persona. So this is to see how design teams react to these. But I think that the point of my presentation today was that, in a way, I'm not so longer interested in changing design practices, which is problematic for a bigger project because...
What's the name of the bigger project?
Sorry, yes. Rethinking AI for just and sustainable future. So
desirable
we took all the-
digitalization.
Yeah.
I just thought it would be good for everyone to know this is a large Mercator project with Bonn, University of Bonn and Cambridge University. And so, and the work that you're doing is part of this project, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much. Kerry, do you want to say more about the translation or how?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just realized I can't really see Apolline from here. Sorry. So if you want to jump in, Apolline as well, please, like, vigorously wave.
Sure, go ahead.
I can interject on her behalf.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. I just don't want us to accidentally exclude you online. Yeah, no, I think all of us, I guess, are thinking about this question of the human and sort of trying to challenge sort of a very narrow understanding of what it means to be human and from our different perspectives and fields. But I think as Taylor has kind of like highlighted, we still exist in this kind of queasy interrelationship with the figure of the human because it's so central to how so many of our technological but also our social projects are structured. And so I guess my work, I think, sits almost between Apolline's and Tom's in that I'm interested in critical race theory approaches to post-humanism because I think they're an important pushback against some of the kind of utopianism that gets associated with like non-in post-human life. And so I think, you know, Haraway's Cyborg, I think is often taken up and used in maybe like bad faith ways, but you know, I'm really indebted to the work of like Jen Haridawan, Zakiya Eman Jackson, who argue that, you know, there can be a bit of a fetishization of kind of ideas of sort of fluidity and outside of the humanness, animality, that doesn't necessarily grapple with like how these ideas have been very deeply racialized. And so for me, you know, I turn to Asian American studies because I see it as offering, you know, maybe a more critical history of the post-human, and the way I think that also Black studies offers a different, also very critical history of the post-human, without necessarily saying that we shouldn't use this term at all, or that it doesn't hold any critical potential. Although there's a really interesting debate between, I think it was Kyla Wazana-Tompkins and Michelle Huang, who had this really interesting essay exchange around like to what extent should critical race theory like still use the post-human, like is that even a helpful term? Apolline, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for including me, Kerry. Yeah, so thanks, Aimee, for this great question. I think maybe in terms of the general project, what is clarifying maybe for the audience is that there are two strands in this larger project, one that is more applied and more tool-oriented. I shouldn't use these terms, but that is more design-oriented, let's say, and more that is more fundamental research in a sense. And I guess that Kerry and I are more contributed to that side of the project. But that said, both strands really converge into a common concern for reopening this question of what counts as desirable and just and sustainable futures. So trying to contribute to a plurality of futures, I guess this is the common research question that we're addressing with each of us with our different disciplinary backgrounds. I guess that for me, what's particularly interesting is that the question of these who gets to imagine the future and whose imagination matters has been around for a long time. So it's been like since the 70s and 80s, especially from the mid 80s onwards, there were a lot of emancipatory visions of cyberspace, but also a lot of concerns about where the women were, where the discussions about race were. And it's striking that these questions have been recurring since then, again and again, and it seems that we're still stuck in the same position. So we need to understand why these critical concerns have not been taken over. So we need to understand also what makes these, once again, hegemonic anti-feminist and maybe racist discourses hold, and that's what prevents critical discourses to being actually heard and to have an effect in practice. I think it's not enough just to integrate a critical discourse in our articles, but we need also to understand why is it that these discourses don't have effect, even if like we have been feminists for a long time now. And what I'm also particularly interested in so I've been working on the posthuman in a different context than Kerry, in the context of transhumanism. So ideas about really changing humanity through technology in more concrete ways. And what I find particularly interesting in this regard is also looking into how futuristic ideas have also contributed to neoliberal ideas, and how this also merges with the history of AI and computing, how economists have thought about how to use AI to run econometric models, how AI theorists have thought about the social world and like how to, and the public sphere in economic terms, drawing on neoliberal ideas. And so there have been a lot of intellectual exchanges here that I think are also interesting. And turning to the sustainability questions also, I think that there is, among historians at least, a lot of interest now in how environmental policies also have been somehow constrained by a particular economicist take on a way to solve environmental issues that maybe is worth also exploring more. Okay, I'm sorry, I've spoken too long.
Thanks. Okay, I think we have a question from Mathew.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I think my question sort of leads on from what Apolline was just talking about, really. First of all, I want to say how much I enjoyed this session. I really enjoyed all of the talks. So it's a question about methods and about, you mentioned that you come from different disciplines, and I can see so many different commonalities in terms of topic, in terms of theme. But I wondered if you could say something about how the methods that you employ, your different disciplinary toolkits, complement each other, or if there have been any synergies or any points where you depart from each other. So just a general question. Thanks.
Should I give it a quick? Yeah, I'll just very quickly try to respond. We haven't done this kind of collaborative work with Kerry, for example, or Apolline, the three of us yet. But we work in a very collaborative environment. So we definitely, so the vibe of our center is definitely encouraging collaborative work, co-authoring papers. So to give you an example of how this could be done, how we try to do it at the center that we work at, we have a colleague who's a specialist in digital immortality and digital, so the like sort of like a critical studies of digital immortality as an idea. And now I'm working with her on translating some of her insights into a speculative design project. So we're imagining a digital afterlife management company as a critical tool to think about some of the questions that come up as now people are producing companies that are supposed to resurrect our grandfathers, grandmothers, parents, ancestors, etc. So just to, yeah, this is just like a glimpse into how we could try to work with Kerry.
Yeah, I guess more broadly, trying to think about how we sort of bring together and synergize, or maybe don't, our different disciplinary expertises. I personally find interdisciplinary work extremely humbling, because you come in with all sorts of grand claims about what your discipline does and what we need. Like, we need this project, we need this new ethic, and then you immediately talk to someone else from another field and they're like, oh, we've been doing that for like 20 years. And you're like, oh, I guess my findings are not potentially as new, as exciting in another discipline as they are here. And so I feel like, you know, it's very productive in some ways, I think, to be kind of forced to come back to the question of like, how do we sort of meaningfully bring together our different bodies of thought in a way that doesn't sort of feel a bit vulturous. I sometimes feel a bit like a vulture, like, oh, I'm just picking little bits out of the disciplines I like. Like, how do we deal seriously with the different kinds of methodological differences? Like, when we have historians in our center who, like, it's very important to them to follow historical methods and approaches, but at the same time, we're trying to combine that maybe with a more ahistorical disciplinary approach. Yeah, while also recognizing that, you know, I don't think any one discipline has this like claim to truth, and so we gain so much, I guess. Yeah, I think in terms of my specific disciplinary approach, like, I guess what maybe would differ from like yours and yours, I feel like I'm drawing from quite a different set of intellectual traditions, because broadly my disciplinary background is gender studies, which would be the same as Apolline, but, you know, I'm drawing off a lot of particular traditions of like US race theory and critical thought, which have like quite a distinct way of thinking about race. And even like within our center, we hold such different views on what we think maybe race and gender are, or how they manifest, that can itself just lead to such like difficult and productive conversations. I'm going to stop there. I don't really think I answered your question, but maybe Apolline's got a better answer.
I would say being cognizant of the time and that the room needs to be prepared for the final session. Apolline, if you want to give a 30-second thought on this, you are very welcome, and then we can wrap up. No pressure.
Yeah, I feel very much the pressure of saying the last words and being on the way to the drink. So I think I'll just leave it as it is. I think Kerry and Tom have covered wonderfully the answer to the value of interdisciplinary question. Thank you.
Thank you again to all three of our speakers. So there's a short break, and in about 15 minutes, our final keynote happening right here.